de l'ALENA
And
dans ce
live now to
contexte.
Ottawa, we listen to former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney.
Monsieur Trump, il faut en prendre puis en laisser. Et moi, je suis d'avis que les positions du Canada sur
Canada's position
les 3 ou
on
4 points
the 3 or 4
en
items
suspens,
that are now in
positions du
discussion,
Canada ne sont pas
Canada's
déraisonnables.
position are not
C'est des
unreasonable.
compromis raisonnables.
Those are
Et j'ai
reasonable
l'impression que dans
compromises. I have the impression that in
des
the
États-Unis
interest of the
et du
United States
Canada,
and of
il y a
Canada,
toutes les raisons au monde de vouloir
there's every reason in the world for us to find a deal very, very shortly. So I remain confident that, and I have always been, but I remain confident that the Trudeau government will be able to conclude these negotiations that are sometimes difficult. In December 2016, you said that Mr. Trump was a perfect gentleman. Those were the words you used. Is that still your opinion? Well, listen, you've mentioned that I didn't know him intimately. I knew him as a friend in New York and in Palm Beach. Socially, I would know him. Never had a deal, a commercial deal with him. And in those circumstances, he was a gentleman in all times. I was seeing him often with my wife, my children. And it was his behavior was really impressive. We had nothing to say against him in that way. Now, he's the president. He runs a country. It's different. What do you think about his presidency? No, I have no comments on this because Mr. Trudeau is called to deal with him. And I want to help Mr. Trudeau and not go against him.
Do you think the government has to give up on supply management?
Laura.
There's a mic. Sorry.
Glenn McGregor, CTV News. I'll let Laura ask her question. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry
sure.
about that.
Yeah.
I didn't even know. What do you think the government has to do in terms of supply management and opening up the dairy sector in the negotiations?
Well, you know, they've already opened it up in the TPP and in the European negotiations by certain percentage points. So it's not as if this is a sacrosanct situation that is not susceptible to compromise. It's already on the table. And I would be very surprised if Canada could achieve a negotiated, successful free trade agreement with the United States without some showing flexibility on some areas of supply management. Now, let me be pretty clear. I never thought that this meant getting rid of supply management. I always thought that they should be more flexible than they were. And my guess is that that's the way it's going to turn out.
Mr. Mulroney, you spoke very favorably of George H. Bush today, in contrast to current leadership, which we presume to mean President Trump.
I didn't mean that.
Oh, okay. Well, I wonder if you could expand a little.
That was an abstract concept.
Okay. Could you expand a little on that and how, following my colleague's question about someone you described as a perfect gentleman, how your opinion of him has changed and exactly why?
Well, look, George Herbert Walker Bush was and is, he's going on 95. I'm going to see him on the 28th down in Kennebunkport. I'm going down to spend some time with him. This is a marvelous guy, great friend of Canada's, brilliant leader of the United States, and a very easy guy to get along with. That was then and now is now. And now we have President Trump, who is, how shall I say, unorthodox in some of his approaches. And, but he was elected by the people of the United States of America. And I learned a long time ago that even if I disagree with an individual, if he was elected by the people, you have to deal with them, and you only deal with people in respect. Otherwise, you don't achieve anything. So I set aside any personal views if I were the Prime Minister, which I, of course, am not. But Mr. Trudeau has set aside any personal views that he may have on specific activities going on in Washington in the greater interests of achieving a national consensus that the Americans, Canadians can sign on to. So, look, it's very easy to get into a shouting contest with somebody, but it's very unprofitable. In the end, you need everybody on side.
Just to follow up on a different topic, Doug Ford's use of the notwithstanding clause on this bill. I understand you have a personal conflict here. Your daughter is the Attorney General of the province and presumably was consulted on this. But I mean, are you concerned in general about premiers now using this for something that seems like a comparatively minor situation?
Well, you could make a case that when it was used in Saskatchewan and the Yukon and other places, that it was for relatively peripheral issues. It's there. It's a constitutional provision. It was agreed to by Mr. Trudeau. It's part of his package, and it's been used a number of times. There's lots of precedent for it. It was used in Quebec in 1988. And I would point out that it wasn't, I've read something that it was the separatist government in Quebec that invoked the notwithstanding clause on Bill 178. That's wrong. It was the Liberal government of Robert Bourassa, supported by Claude Ryan, who invoked the notwithstanding clause. So I think we have to be aware of those things and careful in our condemnations. If this thing was evil, Mr. Trudeau would not have put it in his constitutional package. He put it in there because he was convinced it was good. And so if it's part of the package, it's not anti-democratic to use it, to invoke it if you're the elected premier of a given province. I gave you my view earlier on what I've always thought about the notwithstanding clause. There's no secret in that. I've always felt, that it's, to have, for me, the backbone of our democracy, the strength of our democracy, is the independence and competence of the court system in Canada. We have one that will rival any in the world. And I've always felt that once the Supreme Court of Canada made a decision that strengthened Canada and strengthened our unity, and that I had difficulty with anybody invoking a provision that could override the Supreme Court of Canada. And that's why I opposed it then, and that's why I oppose it today. To say nothing of the fact that it was part of a package which Quebec didn't sign on to, which is no small matter. And the fact that it contained a notwithstanding clause didn't make it any more attractive to me. But in fairness, it was the Western premiers who made it clear to Mr. Trudeau that there would be no constitutional amendment without a safety valve, and they came up with the notwithstanding clause.
Bonjour, Mylène Crête de la presse canadienne. Qu'est-ce que vous répondez
What do you
aux
answer
producteurs de lait qui
to
vous
the
accusent
milk
de nuire aux
producers who are
négociations de la laine à cause de votre
accusing you
position sur la gestion
to
d'offres?
go against the supply management negotiations? Well, no, it's a nonsense. For years, the federal negotiators have made some concessions on supply management with Europe, with the TPP. What I'm suggesting is that they keep an open mind. You see Mr. Trump on TV. Mr. Trump is now saying
Canada has a 300% tariff on Wisconsin milk, and there's going to be no deal without a deal on Wisconsin milk. That accounts for 0.1% of our dairy trade, to say nothing of the entire trade, which is about US dollars, about $700 billion a year. So what are you going to do? Are you going to compromise and resolve this matter? Because you are not going to get a deal of any kind without a compromise that allows Mr. Trump a victory. And for him, a victory is measured, I think, in dealing with, as he calls my farmers, a victory of some kind for his farmers. So alors, c'est pas... Moi, je pense que...
So I think that...
Madame, je comprends bien les cultures.
I understand the farmers.
Je sais pas de démolir...
I'm not trying to destroy supply management. But let's have a bit more flexibility that will enable Mr. Trudeau and Madame Freeland to negotiate a deal that will cover everything.
Pourquoi offrir cette flexibilité?
So why offering this flexibility that the Americans have already rejected by walking away from the Trans-Pacific deal? It has no importance. That's their problem. They are keeping themselves from an amazing market. Now, we're still there, and that's good. But if that's their position, well, my mom kept saying,
never cut off your nose to spite your face.
And that's what Americans are doing right now with the TPP.
Tough luck.
Well, they refuse that flexibility. So why are we coming back to this? Well, listen to me.
Good
It will
afternoon,
be
Katie
settled.
Simpson, CBC News.
How's Washington?
Well, cooler than here,
Yeah.
or warmer than here. My question to you is, some people who are following the talks very closely and are very informed on the nuance of Canada-U.S. trade, people like Derek Burney, are saying that at the end of the day, a NAFTA is going to come down to the mood of the president, whether you catch him in a good mood or a bad mood. Do you agree with that assessment, that this is all about temperament from the White House?
Well, Derek's very rarely wrong on anything. But I'm not there. If you're not in the room with the negotiators, it's hard to understand what the body language is and where the emphasis has to be placed and so on. There's no doubt that Bob Lighthizer is dealing with a special situation down there. And the American side are on a pretty short leash because of President Trump's arguments. I just mentioned the indication of Wisconsin dairy products. You'd have to be foolish not to understand that there's not going to be a deal, period, unless there's a compromise in that area, because that's what he campaigned on, and it's stuck to him, and he's stuck with it. So if we don't find a way to accommodate some of that, then we're not going to have a deal.
So much of the news this week, of course, has been around NAFTA. And I wonder, with all of the uncertainties going on, what's been the effect on Calgary and some of your constituents there?
You know, I was having a great summer. At the beginning of the summer, The Economist ranked Calgary as the best city to live in North America, the 4th best in the world. Things are going well, and then NAFTA and then some not so great court decisions on pipelines really made us start thinking about what our role is and where the future is. On NAFTA, I mean, look, there's politics involved, there's a lot of negotiating happening, but we also know that the commercial relationship between Canada and the United States is one of the most important in the world. Canada remains the top trade partner for something like 39 of the U.S. states. And so it's in everyone's best interest to get this right. I actually have a lot of faith, especially now that there's a more reasonable deadline, that without the constant glare of the cameras, that the negotiators can sit down and get something done. So I'm feeling pretty confident about that. And I think that's really the sentiment across Canada. Now, in Calgary, of course, we have a lot of focus on the energy sector, which has been free-flowing energy between the 3 countries since long before NAFTA. And so we sort of think that there will always be that free flow. Now, that said, a lot of folks said that about cars. And certainly we've had a lot of conversation about the auto sector. So I'm really confident, though, that cooler heads will prevail and that there is a win-win-win there for all three parties.
Well, when you mentioned cars, I think the tariffs, the steel and aluminum tariffs, how much of an impact has that had on you specifically as well in Calgary?
Not so much on us because, Canada's a very big country, so that industry is elsewhere in the country, but we are a trading place in Alberta, not just in energy, but in all of our industries and in ideas and in people. And so it's important for us to maintain that. Canada thinks of itself a little bit like the Netherlands in the 17th century, a trading economy. So we know that there will be a trade relationship with the United States and with Mexico. Canada has free trade with Europe. Canada is a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it actually is a terrific place for global companies that want to grow globally because we still believe in free and fair trade around the world.
Okay, so global companies that you believe should come to Calgary. That brings me to my next question of how are you diversifying? Because so much of your economy in the past has been centered on energy. And I wonder, it's been a rough few years. How are you sort of coming back from that and then looking forward, diversify to help diversify some of their revenue source?
Terrific question. When I graduated with my undergraduate degree some 25 years ago, don't do the math, I was 9, oil and gas accounted for about 50% of Calgary's GDP. Since then, we've had about $1 trillion of investment in that industry, and oil and gas has gone from 50% to 30%. So we've actually been diversifying all over the place. But we continue to do that. And there are areas of strength where we are encouraging global companies to come in. When we think about immigration, for example, and some of the challenges in the U.S., if you want to bring great talent from India, from China, from Europe, we can do the equivalent of an H-1B visa in the US, which is a lottery here, in 2 weeks. And so a lot of companies are finding this is a great place to bring in great global talent. And in Calgary's case, we're really focused, like everybody, on tech and innovation, but specifically on tech and innovation in certain industries. In financial services, where we're a top 25 finance hub in the world, in agribusiness and agri-food, basically just add tech to the end of everything, in fintech and ag tech, as well as in life sciences, in the creative industries where we have a really burgeoning film and TV production sector. In fact, Calgary accounts for more Oscars and Emmys and Golden Globes than any other jurisdiction outside of the US. So these are all areas where we've got strength and we are really continuing to build up. And in energy, not only conventional energy, we're also focused in a big way as one of the world's global hubs on clean tech, green tech, and renewables as we start to transition the economy.
Finally, talk to me a little bit about incentives. I know here in the U.S., states and local cities offer incentives or tax break packages to lure companies on the promise that they'll create jobs. What are some of the incentives you're doing, and do they really work?
Well, so I'm also a business professor when I'm not being the mayor, and I will say that I have a very strong view on whether incentives work or not and how to avoid races for the bottom. That said, Calgary has created an economic development fund, seeded it with $100 million to help companies make those decisions. But the much more important thing than that is the cost advantages in terms of what you're paying for labor, in terms of cost of living. In Silicon Valley right now, for example, even here in New York, the cost of living is so high that it actually makes it difficult to retain talent because people will cross the street for $5,000 because they can't afford rents. And so for Amazon, for example, every city, everywhere bid on Amazon's HQ. We were excited to bid because it gave us a chance to sharpen some numbers and understand our skills. So to give you an example, for a company the size of Amazon, if they had built their HQ2 in Calgary versus in Seattle, they would have saved $1.6 billion a year. Those numbers are way beyond any incentive any government could provide because they're structural. And so what companies looking at Canada will find is, yes, there's a little bit of tax breaks, a little bit of incentives here and there, but the actual structural change by not paying employee health care premiums, by paying people less because they can afford to live on less, those numbers are extraordinary and they dwarf any incentives. That said, we do have an innovation fund. Give me a call if you're interested.
17 days and counting before the U.S. has to present its trade deal with Mexico to Congress, and Canada might miss the chance to join. But CBC News has learned the Canadian government isn't necessarily fretting about the October 1st deadline. The CBC's Katie Simpson is here with the details. Hi, Katie.
Hi.
So what are we learning about this timeline?
So we have been talking about timelines for quite a time when it comes to NAFTA. There are two key timelines in play right now. One has to do with December 1st. We're not talking about that one as much. The leaders of Canada, U.S., and Mexico are aiming to stand on a stage together to sign off on on NAFTA before December 1st. Why is that? The new Mexican leader takes office December 1st, and if something isn't signed before that time, the new leader of Mexico will have to sign off on it, and he doesn't want to. He doesn't want anything. He doesn't want to do that. So the U.S. and Mexico are working on a timeline to get to that point for December 1st. One of the legal hurdles they have to cross is on October 1st. They need to have the text of an agreement to American lawmakers for October 1st. And if they don't have it there, they're going to miss that December 1st deadline. Well, senior sources with direct knowledge of the situation have told me that reason to have all three leaders stand together by December 1st, that is not a good enough reason for Canada to rush to a finish, and that Canada is not going to be prepared to accept things it doesn't want to accept just to meet that deadline. So Canada is comfortable with missing that October 1st deadline that is self-imposed or imposed by the Americans. They're comfortable with that. They're prepared to continue talking after October 1st. Whether the Americans and Mexicans are comfortable with that, that's the bigger question. They're both threatening to move on without Canada if they're not prepared to sign off.
So what happens next?
Well, the next big question is, can the Americans and Mexicans move without Canada? Can they do this? And there are big legal questions about whether they can actually do that. And the U.S. Congress plays a big role in that. They're going to have to vote on this, and they're going to be really the ones who decide, okay, yay or nay. And today, the Democratic House Leader, Nancy Pelosi, she had some very clear words for what she wants to see happen.
I think it should be trilateral. I don't see how you can say we renegotiated the NAFTA, except we made it bilateral instead of trilateral. So I just don't think that that's in the interest of this hemisphere to be able to prevail in the global marketplace.
Now, Nancy Pelosi is a Democrat, and she is never going to agree anything that Donald Trump says. That is sort of the state of political talks in the U.S. right now. But Donald Trump does need Congress on side to get his version of NAFTA approved. And if the Democrats start making a lot of noise of it and some of the Republicans pick up and say, hey, you know what? NAFTA is a trilateral deal. It's important. All three countries are in there. It could be a problem for Donald Trump. It's just so many questions about the timeline, the legal timeline, what can happen next. It's all very much in flux, but the key takeaway from this today, Canada is not in a rush.
Okay. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
And we will see you a bit later with the power panel. I'm very excited. Thanks a lot. So is a deal still possible after October 1st? And how does Canada get there? Joining me now is Canada's former ambassador to the U.S., Derek Burney. Hi, Mr. Burney. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you, Vashi.
Thanks for coming back. I want to start off by asking about deadlines. Obviously, we're 2 weeks away from what is supposed to be the deadline to reveal the text of a deal that for sure probably includes Mexico, but maybe not Canada, or maybe Canada. A senior source told my colleague Katie Simpson that the Canadians are comfortable, I'll read the exact, are comfortable with missing that deadline. What do you make of that?
Well, I think one of the problems in the negotiation up until now has been the absence of a very hard deadline. I know that September 30th is the latest of many deadlines that we've had announced on this negotiation. And I know what it's meant to do is to get us to December 1st with something. But, you know, in Washington, it's never over till it's over, and it never really ever gets over. And we're learning that simply by the fact that we're renegotiating an agreement that we thought was well in place, well accepted, doing good things for all three partners. I still believe that's the case. But in any event, I think we're now in a mutual stare-down period where the Canada and the United States, in any event. I mean, it's a very weird negotiation. We tend to know on the surface what the outstanding issues are, but we don't know the nitty-gritty. Mm-hmm. And so what it looks like is that they're having difficulty convincing one another when is the last inch in the negotiation. And nobody wants to give until they know precisely that that's it, because nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. I mean, that's the mantra of the negotiation. So I think we're going to be in a period of, not knowing where we are until we really believe that it is the final time for making a decision. But even then, if they go with a bilateral with Mexico, is Congress going to approve it? We don't know. Congress gave them the authority for a trilateral, after all, not a bilateral. Now they can change that authority. But it's just very difficult to read. I think we know what the major outstanding issues are, and we know that there's a lot of underbrush that's getting cleaned up, but we really don't know whether it's, I guess what I don't know is whether there's any give on the American side. Up until now, this has been a pretty one-sided negotiation, with the Americans saying we want this, 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 and this to Mexico, and doing the same to Canada. There's not a whole lot of evidence to date about what the Americans are giving in order to get.
You have so much experience at the table in negotiations like this, something like this. How unique is the absence of timelines, the way in which it's progressed, the fact that all the major sticking points seemingly are out there? How unique is it based on your experience?
Well, it's unlike the two previous negotiations, and I think it's unlike most of the trade negotiations that I had any, direct or even indirect involvement, like the multilateral rounds. I mean, it's not normal for countries to be negotiating trade in public the way this one has been negotiated in public. Now, it's reassuring in that there's not going to be any surprise at the end of the day, because all we have to do is measure who gave what on which of the outstanding issues. But it's a very different kind of negotiation, because so much of it is being played out in public on a daily basis, and yet so much is still well below the surface. Very hard to read.
Let me ask you about the Mexico aspect of all of this. Yesterday, Mexico's chief negotiator, Kenneth Smith Ramos, tweeted, Mexico stated from the beginning of the negotiation that the ideal scenario is for NAFTA to remain trilateral. We hope the U.S. and Canada will conclude their bilateral negotiations shortly. If that is not possible, we are ready to advance bilaterally with the U.S. That's pretty explicit.
Yeah, well, it shouldn't surprise anybody. I mean, Canadians were always much more willing to carry Mexico's water than I've ever seen evidence of Mexico doing the same for us. But, Vashi, in a trade negotiation, your obligation is to defend and promote the interests of your country. It's not to help somebody else. So I can understand the Mexicans taking the position they're taking. They're softer on dispute settlement. You know why? They lost most of the cases on dispute settlement. We won a lot of cases on dispute settlement. That's why it's more important to us than it is to them. But I understand why they're prepared to concede on something that wasn't really delivering for them, more so than we are.
Does it impact the amount of pressure on the Canadians or change the game at all for the Canadians now that, although it shouldn't come as a surprise, it is so explicit that they're ready to throw us, for lack of a better term, under the bus?
That good old bus has had many people under it, hasn't it? Well, no, I don't, I think it's a sideshow. I think the real issue is between Canada and the United States. The real issue is dairy, dispute settlement, and although I cannot understand that it's come back, culture. I mean, this was really one that surprises me, because it got nowhere in the initial negotiation or in NAFTA, and I suspect it's not going to go anywhere on this one. But I do think that the crunch issues, the major crunch issues, remain to be dispute settlement and dairy. And as I said earlier, on both cases, Canada is doing the giving. We're not seeing anything coming the other way from the United States. Now, the United States will say, well, yeah, but we've given on the sunset clause. Well, not really, because they introduced the sunset clause. So having agreed to 6 years instead of 5, they think that's a concession. They've got a unilateral definition of concession.
On dairy, on Chapter 19, I'm wondering from when you were sitting at the table, I mean, there's a lot of talk about how will you soften the blow of any concessions made on supply management in Quebec, for example, or with the constituency of farmers that are affected by that. How much thought is given at the table to selling whatever happens domestically once it's all done?
Huge, huge. That has to be the biggest factor of all, because ultimately you have to accept an agreement that you can sell domestically. Mm-hmm. You can't accept an agreement that is one way. Now, the Americans want to change the name of it, I understand. And I've got a good one, because given their tactics to date, I would suggest we change it from NAFTA to SHAFTA. because that's their approach. So that's
I wonder if Donald Trump will go for that.
why I want our team to hold firm. No, because we're in a mutual stare down situation, as I said right now. Who's going to blink and on what and how much?
Okay, we'll be watching. Thank you, Mr. Burney. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Well, U.S. President Donald Trump is taking a more positive tone when it comes to NAFTA, telling reporters that the deal-making with Canada is coming along very well. Joining us now for more is Jameson Burko from BNN Bloomberg. Good morning, sir. Look, it's going well until it's not. That's just how it's felt for over a year here. So where are we really?
And many of the negotiations have kind of happened regardless of what the rhetoric from the White House has been saying, Ben. In many cases, it's just been kind of disregarding whether or not the U.S. president's in a good mood and says something good about the talks or is in a bad mood and threatens the ruination of our economy. So the only real way we can make any progress on these talks is to essentially put those comments aside, compartmentalize them, and just kind of keep our noses to the grindstone, which is exactly what's happening in D.C. right now.
Okay, so what issues are still on the table?
Well, it's just the dispute. It's funny. It's kind of the issues that were on the table in the first place, which makes people think not a lot of progress has been made when really a lot of other issues have actually been addressed already. But it's that dispute resolution mechanism, access to the Canadian dairy market, of course, Quebec, very much up in arms about the idea of giving Americans more access than they already have. But, you had an interesting idea for the dispute resolution mechanism, I think.
Rock, paper, scissors.
See, that sounds good on the surface, but then you start to think, what happens if they're going to go on scissors, or are they going to go rock, paper, scissors, go?
Right, so look, a lot to unpack there.
Thousands of legal precedents there.
Do me a favor, bring that up with the guys at BNN Bloomberg and see if we can get the ball rolling on this.
That's also actually how CEOs get picked by their boards of directors. So,
Jameson, thanks so much. We appreciate the work that you and the team are doing today.
Absolutely, Ben. Thanks.
We have two big economic issues facing Canadians right now, pipeline and NAFTA. And both of them are in worse shape than when the Trudeau Liberals started paying attention to them. Let's just deal with NAFTA first. At the start of the NAFTA negotiations, the Trudeau government came out with this wonderful, big, splendid declaration. We're going to get not only better economic jobs, we are going to have gender equality. We're going to have all kinds of good stuff imposed on the United States. They aren't exactly President Trump's two biggest proposals. And then Mr. Trudeau went on and was spectacularly successful at cheesing off the president, offending the president. Remember G7? So now here we are, the last legs of this. We may have an agreement, but if we have an agreement, it's going to be very different than what Mr. Trudeau envisaged at the start. And we have Mr. Trump staring down Canada, looking to get more jobs. The auto workers are concerned that he's going to try to get all those jobs back to the United States. So we are not exactly in the winning column on NAFTA yet, but we have some promise. As for the pipeline, well, Mr. Trudeau was so confident of that pipeline, he spent $4.5 billion to buy it. He said it's all done. Now we're told we need more consultation, even though every Native group and band who has a claim to land across the path of the pipeline has signed on to it. More consultation. Well, they can do that. Mr. Trudeau also could invoke his constitutional powers, that of the government, bring back Parliament, and give this pipeline a kickstart. But he told an Edmonton radio station the other day that, no, I'm not going to use any tricks. A trick? Constitutional powers since 1867? A trick? It almost makes you want to go back to an earlier Trudeau who said when asked how far he's going to go, he said, just watch me. We need some action. We have a problem in Canada. We can't get anything done. If this was Singapore or China, that pipeline would have been built ages ago, and probably a high-speed railway going alongside it from Alberta to the coast. As Premier Notley says, we have a problem of regulation. It's a regulatory merry-go-round in Canada. We need to address the issue of regulatory change in Canada. It sounds so boring, sounds like a lawyer thing. Regulatory change, but that is what is thwarting Canada. So Mr. Trudeau has to stop sitting on the fence and get down to business and say, I can't appease all the people all of the time. The world doesn't function that way. But decisions have to be made. The decision has to be made to unleash the energy of Canada. Otherwise, we're going to be a country sitting on resources, probably energy poor. We're going to have huge changes in our economy. We need to unleash the power of Canadians and get this country rolling.
Let's get right at it now. The man of the hour is with us. Larry Kudlow joins us from the White House. Larry, before we get to the jobs report, did you write that anonymous op-ed in the New York Times?
I sure didn't. Why would I? I've spent the better part of the last 2+ years helping President Trump develop the very policies that he's been promulgating on taxes and regulation and trade reforms.
Larry, you took my question seriously. Come on, Larry. You know me.
No, somebody, I know, but we'll have some fun, Stu, because I do know you. I saw one magazine finger me among a couple others that should have known better, and I've seen a couple of ankle biters. I mean, for God's sakes. And here's the great part of this story, okay? So, guess what? The policies are working, okay? There is an economic boom. Today's jobs report continues it. Almost nobody believed possible. It's covering wages. It's covering investment. It's covering taxes and inflation and manufacturing. We're not peaking yet. This baby's going on.
Wait a second.
So why would I want to oppose that? I love that.
Aren't you a little disappointed with 201,000 new jobs? Now, let me explain myself. I mean, before the election, before we got these tax cuts in place, we were thinking we're going to get 4 and 5% growth, and we've got 4% growth. We also thought, I was pretty confident that there would be months where you would see 300, maybe 400,000 new jobs. We're not even close. Are you a little disappointed?
No. Give it time, Stu. This thing's building. It's building. I mean, you know, today's figure, plus 201? There's all these crazy summer seasonals. Some people were worried that you might have a decline. No. I mean, what you're doing here is you're creating jobs steadily at a very high level. And I'm not convinced we peaked on that. But the overall story, let's go back to Tuesday, Thursday, the ISMs. There's no better real-time indicator. Manufacturing boomed. Services boomed. In today's report, wages picking up steam. My pal Kevin Hassett of the CEA has shown, by the way, if you calculate them right, real after-tax wages are moving into boom territory. We're clicking on all cylinders. So I'm perfectly happy with what I'm seeing in almost every aspect.
Are we going to get a trade deal with Canada, maybe today?
You know, Stu, I'll give you a maybe. I know they're working hard. I can't predict. I think they're probably working, as you and I are talking. Ambassador Lighthizer, we met yesterday with the president and so forth. We're all working hard. And I think the United States would rather have a trade deal with Canada, but it has to be a good deal, right? And the word that continues to block the deal is MILK. Okay? I just saying, let go. Milk, dairy, drop the barriers, give our farmers a break, and we can fix some other things. So I don't want to predict. I'll just say Bob Lighthizer is doing a great job, and the president is encouraging it.
Tell me about China. There are the two issues there which we don't really talk much about, and that is the theft of intellectual property and the forced takeover of our technology. Yes. You don't hear much about it. Is there any movement under the surface, under the radar here, that you know about on those two issues? Because I really want to know if China's put anything forward, anything to suggest that might accommodate our desire to fix those two issues.
Stu, I don't think they have. I don't think they have specifically. You're 100% right. Look, we talk about this. You know, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin's our team leader on this. Bob Lighthizer our lead negotiator. I've been deeply involved in these talks. They, the Chinese, know exactly what our asks are. And you're right, theft of IP, forced transfer of technology, ownership, Stu. Ownership, okay? They keep saying they're going to let American companies own 51 or 53. It doesn't happen, by the way. We should own 100%, so we don't have to be ordered to lay our blueprints on the table so they can steal our technology. High tariffs, non-tariff barriers with respect to various commodities, industrial goods, and so forth. We're out there. They know exactly what we want to do. You know, remember Mrs. Reagan? Remember, you and I are so old. We remember this. Nancy, when I was here the last time, you know, I come around every 35 years. Mrs. Reagan, to drugs, said, just say no. And she was absolutely right. My advice to my Chinese friends, and some of them have become friends, fellas, just say yes to something.
Good luck with that. Good luck with that,
so we can move forward, you know?
Real fast, social media stocks down this week, down big, actually. I think investors expect regulation to be coming from Congress. Do you think social media, like Facebook and Google and Twitter, do you think they should be in some form regulated? Social media.
I don't want to go that far. We talked about this a week or two back. A lot of people use the word. I never said the word regulation. I never said. I do think they have a lot to be accountable for, okay, with respect to withholding conservative searches and conservative tweets. I think they have a lot to be accountable for. All I'll say is what I said. We are looking at it. National Economic Council, we are engaged in a study at the request of the president to try to look at the facts and some of this, you know, the science and technology. We have no idea where we're going. Regulation, lawsuit, we don't know where we're going. We're just trying to gather information. But let me just say this. I'm not an expert, but I've sure spent a lot of time reading up. Those big outfits have a lot to be accountable for. There's so many anecdotes about withholding conservative, whether it's a search engine or a news engine or just a Twitter. So many unexplained, seems pretty fishy to me. So we're looking at that part of the story, Stu.
Okay.
I don't want to get ahead of it
Understood.
with respect to legal or regulatory actions. Too soon for that.
Larry, it's a great pleasure to have you back on the show, especially because you're clearly in fine form again. You really are. You rate, baby.
It's a boom.
Thanks, Larry.
It's a boom. It's a boom, Stuart. Keep the boom. Yes, sir.
I got it. See you later. Larry Kudlow, everyone.
Thank you.
Let's start with NAFTA, first of all. How confident are you that we see a modernised NAFTA?
Oh, well, we're not confident yet because we don't know what we're actually seeing. There's a bilateral deal where we've seen some heads of agreement but no detail, and we're yet to see what happens with Canada. So we'll have to wait and see on that. There'll just be uncertainty at the moment.
What do you think the main sticking points are when it comes to getting a deal over the line between the US and Canada?
Well, we know that there's questions about the state dispute resolution, there's questions about dairy industry, there's some other specific things. It's not just an agreement about cars and steel and aluminium. It should be far more sophisticated than that.
Do you think there are irreconcilable differences then?
I really don't know, and I don't think people do know around the region yet, and we really want to see how that comes through.
Broadly, when you look at the global trade climate, free traders like your own country, New Zealand, there is a perception that this new normal of aggressive trade policy means that you guys are on the ropes. Is that the case, or are you even more committed to pressing the case for free and liberalised trade?
Most of APEC keep taking every opportunity to say how much trade has benefited them in the past and how much more they're expecting of it. Look at, we're here in Vietnam. Look at the story here. There's a lot of people have improved living standards, but it's got a long way to go yet. And they see that as happening from trade. So no, I think it'll still be a dominant trade story. We have to pay attention to who the end beneficiaries are, but definitely continued policies on opening up trade and reducing barriers behind the borders.
Do you feel that this adversarial narrative when it comes to trade has breathed fresh impetus into the negotiations, whether it's around getting RCEP done possibly by the end of the year, or the viability of CPTPP even without the US?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of pressure on those regional agreements to get them done, to get them ratified, to start implementing and to get them to show some returns, absolutely like that. And RCEP, we don't know, maybe it gets a signature of some sort this year. it probably won't be the most exciting thing we've seen, but it'll be the biggest. If they can get India and China plus all together in the same room, that's half the world.
How confident are you that we are going to see evidence of supply chains relocating away from China towards Southeast Asia, the likes of Vietnam and Thailand? That's a process that was already underway. But again, do you think that that is a process that gets invigorated because of these trade tensions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not changing at the moment, but it's always been a very dynamic part of this region. And there's certainly a lot of supply chain managers, logistics people, purchasing managers, first of all, working out where does their stuff come from and where do the inputs to their stuff come from to check whether or not they're going to run into any problems, tariff or other supply related. Secondly, I think there's restocking going on, and that's part of the very strong US economy is probably inventory build up at the minute. And thirdly, yeah, they're saying, well, if we're part of a supply chain into China and China's got this advantage by big tariffs going into the US, a lot of that stuff going from China into the US is only getting a certain amount built up in China. A lot of it's originating in ASEAN. Will there be a movement of investment in the hubs to cheaper areas, maybe like Vietnam?
Alan, I'm going to ask you to gaze into your crystal ball and look ahead to the fourth quarter of the year, towards year end. Typically, in the developed world, big peak seasonal demand period. That's when the factories over here start to gear up, etc. That is really going to be the real litmus test to how badly stifled supply chains have been, yes?
Well, that'll depend partly on whether or not we're clear about just how problematic all this trade friction is. There's a lot of threats out there at the minute. If those are really put in place, then yes, there will be a test. But it may be there's still a lot of negotiation going on still at that time.